So recently, you were interviewed for a New York Times article about something I knew nothing at all about, which was the purple tomato. So, what in the world is a purple tomato, and why would anybody want one? And how did that all come about?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So Kathy Martin is this really terrific scientist at the John Innes Center in Norwich, England, where I had the privilege to work for a while. I had known her previous to that. And she came up through the ranks of developmental biology and understanding the biochemical pathways that lead to the synthesis of pigments in flowers. Actually, in snapdragons was the model organism. And what she hit on as a fantastic idea was to take two regulatory genes out of snapdragon and put them into tomato, which those two regulatory genes, you can think of them as like switches that flip something on. They turn on this pathway for what's called anthocyanin biosynthesis. And she did it in a way that it specifically turned on in the fruit. And anthocyanins are the chemical compounds that give the purple color, for instance, to blueberry skins or eggplant skins. They have a variety of health benefits attributed to them. You probably know a lot of people like to eat these dark purple fruits, blackberries and the like. People trivialize it as antioxidant. It goes way deeper than that. They have various effects on human metabolism that appear to be positive, ingested in higher quantities than most people's diets have them. So Kathy's idea was, look, people eat a hell of a lot more tomatoes than they do blueberries. Why don't we make a tomato that makes blueberry levels of anthocyanins? And that's what she did. So there's purple tomatoes out there. People are going to say, well, that already exists. Well, actually, if you cut any of those open, they're sort of greenish red in the middle. It's just the skin, the pericarp that's purple. And you have to do this genetic engineering trick to turn that pathway on across the flesh of the fruits of things purple all the way through. Kathy, along with a close colleague of hers going back to grad school days, Jonathan Jones, and other scientists there at the Sainsbury lab in Norwich, he's also a friend of mine, decided they were going to start a small company that would own this technology and try to commercialize it as a GM crop that had actual consumer benefit, as opposed to the GM crops, most of which out there now confer like insect tolerance or herbicide resistance to corn or soybean, which consumers don't care about unless they absolutely hate it for reasons that they don't maybe completely understand, but they hate it anyway. So that was the idea. It's sort of a Sisyphean challenge to try to put a crop on the market that's genetically modified that people actually like. And so I got asked to be on the board of that company something like 14 years ago now. It's an overnight success story, obviously. And we now, what's changed over the last few months is the USDA altered their rule structure so that they more stringently adhere to their mission, which is determine whether a genetically modified crop is a plant pest. And they eliminated a couple of the things that had been done as a matter of course by the big companies who could afford to do it, like doing a field trial. So for instance, tomato, it's not weedy. It has no wild relatives in North America. And presumably there's nothing about turning the fruit purple that's going to turn it into this pestilent weed species that's going to take over the planet. And I think that's a reasonable presumption to make. So now the USDA only says, we just want to review whether the thing is a plant pest risk, which is all they ever had been doing anyway. But the standard had been you do multi-year field trials and all this other stuff, which we basically didn't have the institutional will to do at any reasonable rate, obviously 14 years later. So we submitted what's called a request for a regulatory status review. That's ongoing now. We expect like early next year, the USDA will say, hey, this thing is now considered no longer a regulated article. It's passed through our scrutiny and anybody can grow it without notifying USDA, which would be required now if you were to grow it. So we have a plan in place to put together a limited release of seed for 2022 growing season. There's a website. Here's the paid promotional. It's bigpurpletomato.com. You can go on there and register your interest. And we're going to try to get seed into the hands of avid home gardeners who would like to grow this thing and do kind of a bake off among probably different varieties. So the purple trait's been put into different varieties of tomato that have different agronomic properties, different taste properties, get people to say, hey, we like this one the best, or this one didn't work very well. And then the following year, do something more like a real, commercial launch. So that's kind of the genesis of it and where we're going with it. And, we may attract some corporate interest at some point. The companies typically will say, we can't possibly do that because consumers don't want GM crops. Well, I can tell you right now, from a very difficult to find website, there's a couple hundred people that sure as hell do want them. And we're operating off the Y Combinator theory of it's way better to have a tiny, passionate customer base than it is a big, inchoate, lukewarm customer base. That's how we're starting out.
To me, the GM battle is largely over. I mean, certainly you have the Chuck Benbrooks and the Megan Westgates that were listed in that New York Times article. Those are the people that either run the non-GMO verified project or the one that's kind of, scary doomsayer about GMOs. But it truly will take something like passionate tomato growers that want to put something out there and then have their friends over and they're excited and they show it to them and they cut it and they open it up and they eat it. And I think this is a really fascinating way to do this. And I also think that this applies pressure to the government to get rid of what I consider to be like a complete invention by the large corporations to create these giant moats of regulation. If you're Monsanto, which no longer exists anymore, you think, like, from the outside world, they think, oh man, look at all these activists. Look at how much pain those activists caused Monsanto. And they did in terms of lawsuits over chemistry, but not over the regulation. Because what ended up happening is that you have all these activists that say, oh, they're unsafe. You've got to test these more. This is, they're just so dangerous to humans. So then Monsanto will come along and be like, all right, well, why don't we just add, 2 or 3 more years of testing on there, knowing that each year of testing might be anywhere like all the way up to $10 million a year. So now you've just added $20, $30 million into the regulatory process. And if you're a little tiny company that's trying to do it, then you don't have the option to get your product all the way to market. You must sell to the large companies. And so they created this moat where they said the only way over this is if you use our drawbridge. And I think it made like you said in the article, exactly, like the activists made the companies into exactly what they feared, which were just large, dominant, giant organizations.
Yeah, I have no quibble with that at all. I just loop it back to the organizational bureaucratic structure discussion from earlier. There's zero incentive in most companies for the regulatory groups to make themselves leaner and more effective. So you've also got an incentive of, well, I'm going to have a bigger budget center if I can complexify this thing, right? So that's where having kind of real singular commitment to the larger corporate goal. The larger corporate goal should be, we want to get out a really high quality product as fast as we can because that's good for everybody. But, that's what you run the danger of losing as the organization gets bigger and more complicated. I'd rather optimize my silo instead, right?
I remember vividly when the announcement came out that Bayer was buying Monsanto, the regulatory people going around saying, you know what they really wanted? They really wanted our regulatory team because, we're so good at putting things through. And it was like, it's just that you guys built a system and knew exactly how to navigate it and could just keep brute forcing the problem. So anyway, man, I'm really excited that you guys have done this. I think it's a net positive for the world. And I, for one, I grew Harry Clee tomatoes. So I would be very interested in growing purple tomatoes.
So we're actually working with some of the same parental lines that Harry uses and introgressing the purple trait into those. So, we should be able to produce something that's very similar to some of those varieties, but has this purple phenotype. And it just shows up when they ripen. It's just like instead of turning red, they turn purple.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you'd like to listen to the rest of the interview, it's linked below. And if you like this kind of conversation, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. That's a place where people meet other podcast listeners, get to be a part of a digital neighborhood, and really get a chance to practice things like how they write, their speaking skills, and have a place where they can have an open dialogue with people that want to discuss ideas and leave all of the insults and the craziness of regular social media out of it. So if you're interested, go to network.articulate.ventures.